Sleepy Hollow. Prose by Washington Irving by Geoffrey Crayon, Gent. Having pitched my tent, probably for the remainder of my days, in the neighborhood of Sleepy Hollow, I am tempted to give some few particulars concerning that spellbound region, especially as it has risen to historic importance under the pen of my revered friend and master, the sage historian of the New Netherlands. Beside, I find the very existence of the place has been held in question by many, who, judging from its odd name and from the odd stories current among the vulgar concerning it, have rashly deemed the whole to be a fanciful creation, like the Lubber Land of mariners. I must confess there is some apparent cause for doubt, in consequence of the coloring given by the worthy Diedrich to his descriptions of the hollow, who, in this instance, has departed a little from his usually sober if not severe style, beguiled, very probably, by his predilection for the haunts of his youth, and by a certain lurking taint of romance whenever anything connected with the Dutch was to be described. I shall endeavor to make up for this amiable error on the part of my venerable and venerated friend by presenting the reader with a more precise and statistical account of the hollow, though I am not sure that I shall not be prone to lapse in the end into the very error I am speaking of, so potent is the witchery of the theme. I believe it was the very peculiarity of its name and the idea of something mystic and dreamy connected with it that first led me in my boyish ramblings into Sleepy Hollow. The character of the valley seemed to answer to the name. The slumber of past ages apparently reigned over it. It had not awakened to the stir of improvement which had put all the rest of the world in a bustle. Here reigned good, old long-forgotten fashions. The men were in home-spun garbs, evidently the product of their own farms and the manufacture of their own wives. The women were in primitive short gowns and petticoats, with the venerable sunbonnets of Holland origin. The lower part of the valley was cut up into small farms, each consisting of a little meadow and cornfield, an orchard of sprawling, gnarled apple trees, and a garden, where the rose, the marigold, and the hollyhock were permitted to skirt the domains of the capacious cabbage, the aspiring pea, and the portly pumpkin. Each had its prolific little mansion teeming with children, with an old hat nailed against the wall for the housekeeping wren, a motherly hen, under a coop on the grass plot, clucking to keep around her a brood of vagrant chickens, a cool, stone well, with the moss-covered buckets suspended to the long balancing pole, according to the antediluvian idea of hydraulics, and its spinning wheel humming within doors, the patriarchal music of home manufacture. The hollow at that time was inhabited by families which had existed there from the earliest times, and which, by frequent intermarriage, had become so interwoven, as to make a kind of natural commonwealth. As the families had grown larger, the farms had grown smaller, every new generation requiring a new subdivision, and few thinking of swarming from the native hive. In this way that happy golden mean had been produced, so much extolled by the poets, in which there was no gold and very little silver. One thing which doubtless contributed to keep up this amiable mean was a general repugnance to sordid labor. The sage inhabitants of Sleepy Hollow had read in their Bible, which was the only book they studied, that labor was originally inflicted upon man as a punishment of sin. They regarded it, therefore, with pious abhorrence, and never humiliated themselves to it but in cases of extremity. There seemed, in fact, to be a league and covenant against it throughout the hollow as against a common enemy. Was anyone compelled by dire necessity to repair his house, mend his fences, build a barn, or get in a harvest, he considered it a great evil that entitled him to call in the assistance or his friend. He accordingly proclaimed a bee or rustic gathering, whereupon all his neighbors hurried to his aid like faithful allies, attacked the task with the desperate energy of lazy men eager to overcome a job, and, when it was accomplished, fell to eating and drinking, fiddling and dancing for very joy that so great an amount of labor had been vanquished with so little sweating of the brow. Yet, let it not be supposed that this worthy community was without its periods of arduous activity. Let but a flock of wild pigeons fly across the valley and all Sleepy Hollow was wide awake in an instant. The pigeon season had arrived. Every gun and net was forthwith in requisition. The flail was thrown down on the barn floor. The spade rusted in the garden. The plow stood idle in the furrow. Everyone was to the hillside and stubble field at daybreak to shoot or entrap the pigeons in their periodical migrations. So, likewise, let but the word be given that the shad were ascending the Hudson, and the worthies of the hollow were to be seen launched in boats upon the river setting great stakes, and stretching their nets like gigantic spider webs half across the stream to the great annoyance of navigators. Such are the wise provisions of nature, by which she equalizes rural affairs. A laggard at the plough is often extremely industrious with the fowling piece and fishing net, and, whenever a man is an indifferent farmer, he is apt to be a first-rate sportsman. For catching shad and wild pigeons there were none throughout the country to compare with the lads of Sleepy Hollow. As I have observed, it was the dreamy nature of the name that first beguiled me in the holiday rovings of boyhood into this sequestered region. I shunned, however, the populous parts of the hollow, and sought its retired haunts far in the foldings of the hills, where the Pocantico winds its wizard stream, sometimes silently and darkly through solemn woodlands, sometimes sparkling between grassy borders in fresh, green meadows, sometimes stealing along the feet of rugged heights under the balancing sprays of beech and chestnut trees. 1,000 crystal springs, with which this neighborhood abounds, sent down from the hillsides their whimpering rills, as if to pay tribute to the Pocantico. In this stream I first essayed my unskillful hand at angling. I loved to loiter along it with rod in hand, watching my float as it whirled amid the eddies or drifted into dark holes under twisted roots and sunken logs, where the largest fish are apt to lurk. I delighted to follow it into the brown accesses of the woods, to throw by my fishing gear and sit upon rocks beneath towering oaks and clambering grapevines, bathe my feet in the cool current, and listen to the summer breeze playing among the treetops. My boyish fancy clothed all nature around me with ideal charms, and peopled it with the fairy beings I had read of in poetry and fable. Here it was I gave full scope to my incipient habit of daydreaming, and to a certain propensity to weave up and tint sober realities with my own whims and imaginings, which has sometimes made life a little too much like an Arabian tale to me, and this working-day world rather like a region of romance. The great gathering place of Sleepy Hollow in those days was the church. It stood outside of the hollow, near the great highway, on a green bank, shaded by trees, with the Pocantico sweeping round it and emptying itself into a spacious mill pond. At that time the Sleepy Hollow Church was the only place of worship for a wide neighborhood. It was a venerable edifice, partly of stone and partly of brick, the latter having been brought from Holland in the early days of the province, before the arts in the New Netherlands could aspire to such a fabrication. On a stone above the porch were inscribed the names of the founders: Frederick Philipson, a mighty patroon of the olden time, who reigned over a wide extent of this neighborhood and held his seat of power at Yonkers, and his wife, Katrina van Cortlandt, of the no less potent line of the Van Cortlandts of Croton, who lorded it over a great part of the Highlands. The capacious pulpit, with its wide-spreading sounding board, were likewise early importations from Holland, as also the communion table, of massive form and curious fabric. The same might be said of a weathercock perched on top of the belfry, and which was considered orthodox in all windy matters, until a small pragmatical rival was set up on the other end of the church above the chancel. This latter bore, and still bears, the initials of Frederick Philipson, and assumed great airs in consequence. The usual contradiction ensued that always exists among church weathercocks, which can never be brought to agree as to the point from which the wind blows, having doubtless acquired, from their position, the Christian propensity to schism and controversy. Behind the church, and sloping up a gentle acclivity, was its capacious burying ground, in which slept the earliest fathers of this rural neighborhood. Here were tombstones of the rudest sculpture, on which were inscribed, in Dutch, the names and virtues of many of the first settlers, with their portraitures curiously carved in similitude of cherubs. Long rows of grave stones, side by side, of similar names, but various dates, showed that generation after generation of the same families had followed each other and been garnered together in this last gathering place of kindred. Let me speak of this quiet graveyard with all due reverence, for I owe it amends for the heedlessness of my boyish days. I blush to acknowledge the thoughtless frolic with which, in company with other whipsters, I have sported within its sacred bounds during the intervals of worship, chasing butterflies, plucking wildflowers, or vying with each other who could leap over the tallest tombstones, until checked by the stern voice of the sexton. The congregation was, in those days, of a really rural character. City fashions were as yet unknown, or unregarded, by the country people of the neighborhood. Steamboats had not as yet confounded town with country. A weekly market boat from Terrytown, the farmer's daughter, navigated by the worthy Gabriel Requa, was the only communication between all these parts and the metropolis. A rustic belle in those days considered a visit to the city in much the same light as one of our modern fashionable ladies regards a visit to Europe, an event that may possibly take place once in the course of a lifetime, but to be hoped for, rather than expected. Hence the array of the congregation was chiefly after the primitive fashions existing in Sleepy Hollow, or if, by chance, there was a departure from the Dutch sunbonnet, or the apparition of a bright gown of flowered calico, it caused quite a sensation throughout the church. As the dominie generally preached by the hour, a bucket of water was providently placed on a bench near the door, in summer, with a tin cup beside it, for the solace of those who might be athirst, either from the heat of the weather, or the drouth of the sermon. Around the pulpit, and behind the communion table, sat the elders of the church, reverend, grey-headed, leathern-visaged men, whom I regarded with awe, as so many apostles. They were stern in their sanctity, kept a vigilant eye upon my giggling companions and myself, and shook a rebuking finger at any boyish device to relieve the tediousness of compulsory devotion. Vain, however, were all their efforts at vigilance. Scarcely had the preacher held forth for half an hour, on one of his interminable sermons, than it seemed as if the drowsy influence of Sleepy Hollow breathed into the place. One by one the congregation sank into slumber. The sanctified elders leaned back in their pews, spreading their handkerchiefs over their faces, as if to keep off the flies, while the locusts in the neighboring trees would spin out their sultry summer notes, as if in imitation of the sleep-provoking tones of the dominie. I have thus endeavored to give an idea of Sleepy Hollow and its church, as I recollect them to have been in the days of my boyhood. It was in my stripling days, when a few years had passed over my head, that I revisited them, in company with the venerable Diedrich. I shall never forget the antiquarian reverence with which that sage and excellent man contemplated the church. It seemed as if all his pious enthusiasm for the ancient Dutch dynasty swelled within his bosom at the sight. The tears stood in his eyes, as he regarded the pulpit and the communion table. Even the very bricks that had come from the mother country seemed to touch a filial chord within his bosom. He almost bowed in deference to the stone above the porch, containing the names of Frederick Philipson and Katrina van Cortlandt, regarding it as the linking together of those patronymic names, once so famous along the banks of the Hudson, or rather as a keystone, binding that mighty Dutch family connection of yore, one foot of which rested on Yonkers, and the other on the Groton. Nor did he forbear to notice with admiration the windy contest which had been carried on, since time immemorial, and with real Dutch perseverance, between the two weathercocks, though I could easily perceive he coincided with the one which had come from Holland. Together we paced the ample churchyard. With deep veneration would he turn down the weeds and brambles that obscured the modest brown gravestones, half sunk in earth, on which were recorded, in Dutch, the names of the patriarchs of ancient days, the Akkers, the Van Tassels, and the Van Warts. As we sat on one of the tombstones, he recounted to me the exploits of many of these worthies, and my heart smote me, when I heard of their great doings in days of yore, to think how heedlessly I had once sported over their graves. From the church, the venerable Diedrich proceeded in his researches up the hollow. The genius of the place seemed to hail its future historian. All nature was alive with gratulation. The quail whistled a greeting from the cornfield. The robin caroled a song of praise from the orchard. The loquacious catbird flew from bush to bush, with restless wing, proclaiming his approach in every variety of note, and anon would whisk about, and perk inquisitively into his face, as if to get a knowledge of his physiognomy. The woodpecker, also, tapped a tattoo on the hollow apple tree, and then peered knowingly round the trunk, to see how the great Diedrich relished his salutation, while the ground squirrel scampered along the fence, and occasionally whisked his tail over his head, by way of a huzzah. The worthy Diedrich pursued his researches in the valley with characteristic devotion, entering familiarly into the various cottages, and gossiping with the simple folk, in the style of their own simplicity. I confess my heart yearned with admiration, to see so great a man, in his eager quest after knowledge, humbly demeaning himself to curry favor with the humblest, sitting patiently on a three-legged stool, patting the children, and taking a purring grimalkin on his lap, while he conciliated the goodwill of the old Dutch housewife, and drew from her long ghost stories, spun out to the humming accompaniment of her wheel. His greatest treasure of historic lore, however, was discovered in an old goblin-looking mill, situated among rocks and waterfalls, with clanking wheels, and rushing streams, and all kinds of uncouth noises. A horseshoe, nailed to the door, to keep off witches and evil spirits, showed that this mill was subject to awful visitations. As we approached it, an old negro thrust his head, all dabbled with flour, out of a hole above the water wheel, and grinned, and rolled his eyes, and looked like the very hobgoblin of the place. The illustrious Diedrich fixed upon him, at once, as the very one to give him that invaluable kind of information never to be acquired from books. He beckoned him from his nest, sat with him by the hour on a broken millstone, by the side of the waterfall, heedless of the noise of the water, and the clatter of the mill, and I verily believe it was to his conference with this African sage, and the precious revelations of the good dame of the spinning wheel, that we are indebted for the surprising, though true history of Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman, which has since astounded and edified the world. But I have said enough of the good old times of my youthful days. Let me speak of the Hollow as I found it, after an absence of many years, when it was kindly given me once more to revisit the haunts of my boyhood. It was a genial day, as I approached that fated region. The warm sunshine was tempered by a slight haze, so as to give a dreamy effect to the landscape. Not a breath of air shook the foliage. The broad Tapan Sea was without a ripple, and the sloops, with drooping sails, slept on its grassy bosom. Columns of smoke, from burning brush wood, rose lazily from the folds of the hills, on the opposite side of the river, and slowly expanded in mid-air. The distant lowing of a cow, or the noontide crowing of a cock, coming faintly to the ear, seemed to illustrate, rather than disturb, the drowsy quiet of the scene. I entered the hollow with a beating heart. Contrary to my apprehensions, I found it but little changed. The march of intellect, which had made such rapid strides along every river and highway, had not yet, apparently, turned down into this favored valley. Perhaps the wizard spell of ancient days still reigned over the place, binding up the faculties of the inhabitants in happy contentment with things as they had been handed down to them from yore. There were the same little farms and farmhouses, with their old hats for the housekeeping wren, their stone wells, moss-covered buckets, and long balancing poles. There were the same little rills, whimpering down to pay their tributes to the Pocantico, while that wizard stream still kept on its course, as of old, through solemn woodlands and fresh green meadows, nor were there wanting joyous holiday boys to loiter along its banks, as I have done, throw their pinhooks in the stream, or launch their mimic barks. I watched them with a kind of melancholy pleasure, wondering whether they were under the same spell of the fancy that once rendered this valley a fairyland to me. Alas! Alas! To me everything now stood revealed in its simple reality. The echoes no longer answered with wizard tongues. The dream of youth was at an end. The spell of Sleepy Hollow was broken. I sought the ancient church on the following Sunday. There it stood, on its green bank, among the trees. The Pocantico swept by it in a deep dark stream, where I had so often angled. There expanded the mill pond, as of old, with the cows under the willows on its margin, knee-deep in water, chewing the cud, and lashing the flies from their sides with their tails. The hand of improvement, however, had been busy with the venerable pile. The pulpit, fabricated in Holland, had been superseded by one of modern construction, and the front of the semi-Gothic edifice was decorated by a semi-Grecian portico. Fortunately, the two weathercocks remained undisturbed on their perches at each end of the church, and still kept up a diametrical opposition to each other on all points of windy doctrine. On entering the church the changes of time continued to be apparent. The elders round the pulpit were men whom I had left in the gamesome frolic of their youth, but who had succeeded to the sanctity of station of which they once had stood so much in awe. What most struck my eye was the change in the female part of the congregation. Instead of the primitive garbs of homespun manufacture and antique Dutch fashion, I beheld French sleeves, French capes, and French collars, and a fearful fluttering of French ribands. When the service was ended I sought the churchyard, in which I had sported in my unthinking days of boyhood. Several of the modest brown stones, on which were recorded in Dutch the names and virtues of the patriarchs, had disappeared, and had been succeeded by others of white marble, with urns and wreaths, and scraps of English tombstone poetry, marking the intrusion of taste and literature and the English language in this once unsophisticated Dutch neighborhood. As I was stumbling about among these silent yet eloquent memorials of the dead, I came upon names familiar to me, of those who had paid the debt of nature during the long interval of my absence. Some, I remembered, my companions in boyhood, who had sported with me on the very sod under which they were now mouldering. Others who in those days had been the flower of the yeomanry, figuring in Sunday finery on the church green. Others, the white-haired elders of the sanctuary, once arrayed in awful sanctity around the pulpit, and ever ready to rebuke the ill-timed mirth of the wanton stripling who, now a man, sobered by years, and schooled by vicissitudes, looked down pensively upon their graves. Our fathers, thought I, where are they? And the prophets, can they live forever? I was disturbed in my meditations by the noise of a troop of idle urchins, who came gambolling about the place where I had so often gamboled. They were checked, as I and my playmates had often been, by the voice of the sexton, a man staid in years and demeanor. I looked wistfully in his face. Had I met him anywhere else, I should probably have passed him by without remark. But here I was alive to the traces of former times, and detected in the demure features of this guardian of the sanctuary the lurking lineaments of one of the very playmates I have alluded to. We renewed our acquaintance. He sat down beside me, on one of the tombstones over which we had leapt in our juvenile sports, and we talked together about our boyish days, and held edifying discourse on the instability of all sublunary things, as instanced in the scene around us. He was rich in historic lore, as to the events of the last 30 years and the circumference of 30 miles, and from him I learned the appalling revolution that was taking place throughout the neighborhood. All this I clearly perceived he attributed to the boasted march of intellect, or rather to the all-pervading influence of steam. He bewailed the times when the only communication with town was by the weekly market boat, the farmer's daughter, which, under the pilotage of the worthy Gabriel Requa, braved the perils of the Tapan Sea. Alas! Gabriel and the farmer's daughter slept in peace. 2 steamboats now splashed and paddled up daily to the little rural port of Tarrytown. The spirit of speculation and improvement had seized even upon that once quiet and unambitious little dorp. The whole neighborhood was laid out into town lots. Instead of the little tavern below the hill, where the farmers used to loiter on market days and indulge in cider and gingerbread, an ambitious hotel, with cupola and verandas, now crested the summit, among churches built in the Grecian and Gothic styles, showing the great increase of piety and polite taste in the neighborhood. As to Dutch dresses and sun bonnets, they were no longer tolerated, or even thought of. Not a farmer's daughter but now went to town for the fashions. Nay, a city milliner had recently set up in the village, who threatened to reform the heads of the whole neighborhood. I had heard enough. I thanked my old playmate for his intelligence, and departed from the Sleepy Hollow church with the sad conviction that I had beheld the last lingerings of the good old Dutch times in this once favored region. If anything were wanting to confirm this impression, it would be the intelligence which has just reached me, that a bank is about to be established in the aspiring little port just mentioned. The fate of the neighborhood is therefore sealed. I see no hope of averting it. The golden mean is at an end. The country is suddenly to be deluged with wealth. The late simple farmers are to become bank directors and drink claret and champagne, and their wives and daughters to figure in French hats and feathers, for French wines and French fashions commonly keep pace with paper money. How can I hope that even Sleepy Hollow can escape the general inundation? In a little while, I fear the slumber of ages will be at end. The strum of the piano will succeed to the hum of the spinning wheel, the trill of the Italian opera to the nasal quaver of Ichabod Crane. And the antiquarian visitor to the hollow, in the petulance of his disappointment, may pronounce all that I have recorded of that once favored region a fable.